Okay, Tim, let's talk a little bit about the original intent of the Constitution. It's my understanding that there's a little period in American history that maybe a lot of people don't know that much about, that actually before the ratification of the Constitution, there was a very prolonged, very detailed public debate. Took place in newspapers and whatever, but again, very public and very thorough debate of the whole idea of should we have a powerful central government or should it be a more decentralized government? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh yeah, I'd be happy to. So the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, those were the two primary groups during the founding period. After the Articles of Confederation, people decided that there wasn't enough authority at the central government level. They needed a very small amount more because some states had levied tariffs on other states and etc. So what they did is they created the Constitution, and a lot of people believed when they looked in the Constitution that it created too powerful of a central government for a very few specific reasons. There was, the General Welfare Clause, and if you read it, it says federal government can create the general welfare. Well, all of these can ensure the general welfare. All of these concerns were answered over a 2-year period from 1787 to 1789. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists wrote the Federalist Papers and some other stuff. I mean, there were more debates than that, but most people just focus on the Federalist Papers, and so that's generally where I try and constrain it because they're more well known. The Federalist Papers, the Federalists wanted a certain strength of the government, and the Anti-Federalists were trying to derail ratification of the Constitution. And the Federalists wrote articles to relieve the citizens of their concerns over the strength of the central government that they were creating. So, for instance, lots of the Anti-Federalists would object to the necessary and proper. They'll say, well, when you say necessary and proper, the federal government's going to use that to mean that it can do whatever it wants because it's necessary and proper. And you probably heard this argument in your high school, where they say that it's the flexible clause, which it never was. But what happened is the Anti-Federalists said, well, this is going to create too big of a federal government. And the Federalists came forth and said, no, it's not going to create that big of a federal government. This is exactly the way it's going to be interpreted. And they put it down on paper. And so we have exactly what the original intent of the founders was in the form of the Federalist Papers. And there's an understanding in law that the friends of a law, when it's being ratified, what they said it would mean before it gets signed is what the law means. That is, they sold it to the people who are against it by telling them exactly how it would be understood. And obviously, because they ratified it, they believed them. That means that was the original intent of the instrument. The original intent was what the Federalists said it was going to be when they wrote the Federalist documents.
Okay, Tim, could you talk a little bit more specifically about 3 clauses in the Constitution: the Interstate Commerce Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, and the General Welfare Clause? It seems that these are 3 of the pillars with which the federal government uses to claim the authority for most of their overreach. Tell us a bit more about those.
Oh, that's a very good discussion. So in Article 1, Section 8, there are the 3 phrases that you referred to, the 3 clauses that you referred to. There's the General Welfare Clause. So general welfare is actually referred to in the preamble and in the Article 1, Section 8. The preamble confers no powers. It only tells you what the document is intended to do. So, but Article 1, Section 8 actually infers powers. So what the General Welfare Clause was, is they said that the United States, the Congress, may raise taxes, borrow on the credit of the United States to pay the bills and ensure the domestic welfare and common defense. What that was and what it was described in the Federalist Papers by James Madison, I believe it was Federalist 42, he said that that was only a category, right? That was essentially what that said was anything that the government spent had to be for the general welfare as opposed to specific welfare. It had to be anything that benefited, anything that they did had to benefit all the states equally. It couldn't be, say they're allowed to build postal roads. They couldn't build postal roads only in Massachusetts to the detriment of Georgia. They had to build postal roads throughout the Union, otherwise they weren't within the General Welfare Clause. And so the Commerce Clause, the Interstate Commerce Clause, was to prevent the states from establishing tariffs between the states. So, and James Madison addressed this a few times, even after he got out of the presidency, but also in the Federalist Papers. He referred to it as preventing the states from trying to strengthen their industry at the expense of other states' industry. So it made it so it was uniform, so we couldn't stifle trade between, say, Oregon and Washington. There couldn't be a tariff in there. What it essentially did was create a free trade zone within the entire United States. And then there was the necessary and proper clause, which in Federalist 33, Alexander Hamilton addressed. He said that the clause would, the Constitution would be exactly the same with the clause missing. And if you read the clause, it specifically says the Congress is authorized to pass all laws necessary and proper to bring into effect the foregoing powers. So it's referring only to the foregoing powers, the powers that were stated before it. Which, since the necessary and proper clause is at the end of the Constitution, that means all the powers, all the other powers in Article 1, Section 8. And what that is that's incidental powers. Incidental powers have to be smaller than the power that they're incidental to. So they would be incidental to, say, the Commerce Clause. So an incidental power for the Commerce Clause might be, well, that's a bad one. To raise an army. An incidental clause for raising an army would be buying weapons or paying troops or building barracks. An incidental clause for raising an army would not be bases overseas, because bases overseas aren't necessary for the United States Army.
Okay, so you've covered the Interstate Commerce Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, and the General Welfare Clause. Can you give us more examples of how these are misinterpreted or misconstrued to allow, theoretically, the federal government to grasp powers that they don't really have? Tell us about how they're misusing these.
I think the most startling example is the Interstate Commerce Clause. In the Great Depression, they had a case. The federal government did a lot of weird things during the Great Depression. During a time of unprecedented hunger in America, they burned crops. They prevented farmers from growing anymore. They slaughtered, cattle to prevent the prices from falling further, which is great for farmers, but of course not so good for anybody who's not a farmer. And for that matter, for farmers buying stuff besides what they grow. So what Wickard versus Filburn, which is the case that I'm about to address, that was about a farmer who he grew his allowed amount of crops and sold them. And then he grew a little bit extra. He didn't sell them. He actually just used them to feed his livestock. Now, what the federal government's case said, well, since you grew it instead of buying it on the open market, that impacted interstate commerce. So what they were essentially saying is they're allowed to regulate not only what isn't interstate, what isn't commerce, but just what you do on your own land. So now Interstate Commerce Clause means that they can tell you what you can consume, what you can sell, whether or not it leaves the state, what you can do anywhere. And that, of course, is a violation of the interstate commerce. I mean, there's no authority in the Constitution to tell people what they're allowed to consume, or for that matter, what you're allowed to sell to your neighbor, unless your neighbor lives across state bounds.
Okay, what about the necessary and proper clause? Tell us a bit about how that is misconstrued.
Well, that one, you go back to the bank debate, the debate on the bank, and that was a debate between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. And Alexander Hamilton said that because the federal government had some economic powers, that it would make them easier by having a national bank. And Thomas Jefferson said, no, it's merely convenient, but it's not an enumerated power. The federal government, actually, John Marshall, who was the Supreme Court justice at the time, the chief justice of the Supreme Court at the time, he sided with Hamilton, saying that, well, the federal government has some powers that are economic, and so it's only reasonable that they have the power to make their own bank. Of course, that is not only reasonable. The bank is not a power. Only enumerated powers are the federal government's to take.
Okay. Anything more you can mention about the general welfare clause?
Well, general welfare. People look at the general welfare and just the way it's been. Anybody uses that as a catch-all in the Constitution. They say, well, the general welfare it means that we have to do whatever can be done with money and might improve the welfare of the United States. Well, if you interpret it that way, of course, the Constitution could have stopped at that clause and said just, the general welfare. And there's a point in construction law where it says every item in a contract has to mean something. You can't assume that the general welfare clause gave them blanket power to do everything, because then why would they have continued with the enumeration? Why would they have written up the power to raise an army? Because that's obviously for the general welfare. Why would they have written up the ability to build postal roads? Because that's obviously for the general welfare as well. So you can't assume that just because there is it says general welfare that they can do whatever they want.
So with these clauses and their very wide open interpretation of them, they essentially are doing whatever they want. They feel they have the authority based on these. And why would we even have a constitution? What is the point of having a constitution to begin with if they're just going to interpret these things to mean they can do whatever they want? What's the purpose of this document if it's not to restrain their authority?
Exactly. So the purpose of a written constitution, and every founder believed this, at the founding, was because it would be written down so everybody knows what it says, and so that people would actually be restrained by it. They had to abide by what was intended for it to mean. But if you can interpret it away to mean anything, if the Constitution can mean whatever a person in power wants it to mean, then it's no restraint at all on them. I mean, obviously, if I'm in power and it's up to me to determine what power I have, I'd like the power to go into your fridge at night and take the leftovers because I'm kind of hungry. Obviously they didn't mean that.